Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. The hardest thing about preparing for power outages is that you never really know how long that they're going to last. I know that a few years ago, the ice storm that we had here in Texas, it took a lot of folks by surprise because places that don't normally have to deal with power outages lost their power for several days. And it could have been a lot worse. We were only minutes away from a catastrophic grid collapse that could have left pretty much the entire state in the dark for months. Then there's other things like cyber attacks or EMPs that could result in long-term blackouts as well. So today we're going to talk about lighting methods that would be useful during winter power outages like we have probably coming up, and then other more serious survival situations. Probably the best general purpose lighting for most power outages is going to be anything with an LED. I talk about these pretty much any time that I do a blackout or power outage video, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them today, but they are nice since they're energy efficient and they produce a lot of light. And they're also cheap. This is a little lantern by Energizer that I picked up a while back. You can almost always find that one for under 20 bucks. It can produce up to 500 lumens and it can run on either 3 AA's or 3 D cells. I've been using it in my wife and I's bedroom after we put our son to bed. It gives us enough light that we can see pretty well without keeping stinkweed up any longer than he already is going to be anyway. Then of course you can also get LED headlamps and flashlights. These are way brighter than the incandescent ones most of us grew up with, and they're also much smaller than like the gigantic mag lights. My EDC light's rated for up to 1750 lumens, and even this cheap $15 headlamp puts out I think like 250. Its light doesn't travel very far, but it works well if you need to see up close. A lot of LED lights have rechargeable batteries, and even those that don't can use rechargeable variants of common battery types. So if you have some sort of backup power source, you should be able to keep these lights running for a while, and then if you have solar power, you should be able to keep these running pretty much indefinitely. But even though I do like LED lights, they're not the only kind of lighting that you may want to have during a longer term or winter survival situation. Since they're so efficient, they produce almost no heat, and while that's great during summer power outages, any additional heat you can get during the colder months is always a good thing. Now, obviously a light isn't going to produce as much heat as something like a buddy heater, wood stove, or fireplace will, but every little bit does help, and even a small flame can help take the edge off of the cold if you're close enough to it. One winter lighting method that I've grown really fond of over the past couple years is the candle lantern. The ones made by UCO are probably the most common, and you can get them in a couple of different sizes. The small one here is good for vehicle survival kits, and a lot of people use them when they're camping to prevent ice from building up on the inside of their tent. Then this larger one's good for home use, and it can also heat up water or soup. But one really nice thing about these is that you can make your own candles for them. Being able to make your own candles for these lanterns is nice for a couple of reasons. First, it'll end up being a lot cheaper than buying them from UCO. One 3-pack of their beeswax candles is around $15. If you use these things a lot or if you have multiple lanterns, then running them is going to get very expensive very fast. That cost also makes them pretty hard to stockpile in large quantities. Then, since wax is natural and doesn't need modern technology to produce, candles are a viable solution for longer term situations. If you keep bees or know anyone that does, you could use these types of lanterns forever. And when it comes to making candles for them, there's a lot of ways you can go about doing it. I personally chose to go the Gucci route, and I picked up a pre-made silicone mold. I got this from a place called The Handmade Charm. She's a lady who sells her stuff on Amazon and also runs an Etsy shop. But as you can see, this mold can produce up to 3 candles at one time. You can also go the cheaper route and make your own out of PVC pipe. I know that Jiu-Jitsu 2000 did a video several years back showing how that you could use like a 1 1/4 inch PVC pipe and a PVC plug to do pretty much the same thing. However, you are going to need some kind of mold, and I'll be sure to link to this one in the description below. Then after that, you'll need some other odds and ends. Here I have a bunch of wicks that already have wick tabs attached to them, and getting these was a mistake. Since they have a wick tab already crimped in place, you're not going to have anything to grab onto when you go to pull the candle out of the mold. So I ended up having to snip the wick tab off the end, go get some new wick tabs at Hobby Lobby, and then connect those to the wicks. As you can see, I left a little bit of the wick sticking out of the back of the tabs, and that'll serve as my grab handles. You're also going to need a long needle to run the wick through the bottom of the mold, and for this I just went and picked up a cheap upholstery needle set at a local craft store. Then, of course, you're going to need some wax and a way to melt it. For my wax, I ordered this 5-pound box of what are allegedly beeswax pellets. I have my suspicions, though, that it's not 100% beeswax since it was produced overseas, and a lot of those other countries have slightly different labeling rules than we do, and it also doesn't smell like any other beeswax that I've used. But at the end of the day, it has a lot of good reviews and it doesn't seem to have killed anyone, so we're gonna go ahead and give it a shot. I also borrowed this wax melting pot from my mom, and it makes the whole process a whole lot easier. But of course, you can always just melt your wax in a small pot on like your stovetop or a camp stove. Now, when going through this process, the first thing that you want to do is run the wicks through the hole in the mold. To do this, just thread the wick into the needle's eye and then push it through the hole. As you do this, be careful not to poke an extra hole in the mold or stab yourself with the pokey end of the needle. Once again, this should be one of those things that should be obvious, but you know, people are people. Then do the same thing for the other cavities. You may notice that my wick tab is a little ways inside of the mold, and the reason for this is that the candles are a little too long if I fill the cavities all the way to the top with wax, and keeping the tabs a little bit below the top just gives me a good stopping point when I pour the wax later on. After you get all the wicks inside of the mold, use something like a bobby pin to help center the wicks. Once you slide the bobby pin onto the wick, pull on the wick just a little bit to put some pressure on the bobby pin and the mold, and that'll help keep everything in place. Next, go ahead and heat up your wax. Be careful not to get it too hot or stir too quickly, because if you do that, you're going to get a lot of bubbles in it, which will cause air pockets in your candles. After your wax is melted, carefully pour it into the mold, and I went ahead and put my mold on a cookie sheet to make things just a little less messy. And when you do this, take it slow to avoid spilling wax and also to help reduce air bubbles. If there are any bubbles in the wax, then you can use a needle to help bring them to the top. That's especially useful for bubbles that are resting on like the side of the mold, and you can also tap the mold to reduce bubbles as well. Then this is where the waiting game begins. You'll need to give the wax time to cool down and solidify, but after around 30 minutes or so, you can add more wax to the top of the candle to get the top of it a little bit more even and get rid of any dead air space near the top of the wick. Just use a heat gun or hair dryer to melt the top part of the wax and then pour some more wax onto it. You may need to do this a couple of times to get the wax flush with the wick tab. Keep in mind that wax shrinks as it cools, so when you leave and come back, you may see some sort of a moat-looking dip between the wick tab and the edge of the candle mold. After you get the candle looking the way that you want it, you'll need to wait several hours for the wax to cool down. How long this takes is going to depend on how hot your wax was when you poured it, and then also the kind of wax that you're using. You can feel the side of the mold to see if it's still warm, but letting the candle sit overnight is a good general rule. But once your candles are cooled down, you can take them out of the mold. Start by bending the mold to separate it from the candles, then you can pull on the wick at the top or push the candle from the bottom to get it out. This will take a little bit of work since there's going to be some air suction in there. Just be careful not to mess up your mold. Once you have your candles out, you can use some scissors to trim the wick. Remove the portion that you used as your grab handle by cutting it as close to the candle as possible, but also be sure to leave some wick at the top so that you can actually light your candle. After that, your candles will be ready to use in your lanterns. Just install them into the lantern the same exact way that you would the originals, and you're good to go. I would recommend, though, doing a test run to make sure that everything fits before you start making a bunch of candles. My first batch was too tall since I filled the molds all the way to the top, and having dozens of candles with that issue would have been a big pain in the butt to deal with later on. Now, even though I really like my candle lanterns, they aren't actually very bright. It's really kind of hard to find a non-electric lighting method that's as bright as modern electric lighting. That's why it was such a breakthrough. Traditional oil lamps and hurricane lanterns really aren't that much brighter than a candle lantern, and propane lanterns, even though they're very bright, rely on a finite fuel source that's difficult and expensive to store in large quantities. White gas lanterns are a little better, but they need to be pumped, and if that pump wears out, it won't work anymore. However, one lighting method that solves a lot of these problems is the Aladdin lamp. These run on kerosene or a few other similar fuels. I'm using clean heat to cut down on the smell, but lamps like this are sort of a hybrid between traditional oil lamps and white gas or propane lanterns. Like oil lamps, they use a wick to move fuel into the burner, but they also use a mantle similar to those found in white gas or propane lanterns to produce a very bright light. These would be ideal for power outages during cold months, since in addition to giving you quite a bit of light, they also give off some heat as well. The only downsides to these are their cost and that they're pretty fragile. This one cost over $200 and the price just goes up from there. Then as you can see, almost everything on there is glass except the burner and a couple other small parts. And the mantle that produces the light is pretty fragile too. So this isn't something that you're going to take camping with you or just fling into your back seat if you need to bug out. Lamps like this are mainly designed for home use and are meant to stay in the same spot while they're lit. The fount on this particular lamp can hold around 32 ounces of fuel, which should keep it running for 10 to 12 hours. So that means a gallon jug of fuel like what I have here should last you around 40 to 48 hours. Since it costs around $16, that comes to around $4 per fill, at least based on my local prices, and that's slightly cheaper than propane and white gas, and it's even more so if you use kerosene instead of clean heat because kerosene's a little cheaper. Then the mantle should be good for around 3 months of daily use, and the wick should be good for around 6 months of daily use. To use an Aladdin lamp, first remove the top part of the lamp, just unscrew it and set it out of the way. After that, use the knob on the side of the lamp to raise your wick up just a little bit. Then use a match or lighter to light it. It's a little different than the wick on a regular oil lamp, since the flame is a ring going around the top and it's also blue. After that, put the top part of the lamp back in its place and screw it back on. Then use the knob to raise the wick a little bit more, and when you do this, the mantle should start to glow, but don't raise it up too much. You'll need to give the lamp some time to warm up, because if you don't do that, it could damage parts of the lamp, including like the glass chimney and then also the mantle. So go ahead, wait for around 20 minutes or so and then turn it up. Just don't do it so much that the mantle begins to scorch. Now, aside from regular use, another thing you need to know about these is how to change out a mantle. When you get a new one, it'll come shipped with this blue stuff on it, and the same is true for the one that you'll receive with your lamp. The blue coating is there to protect it during shipping, and you're going to need to burn it off before you use your lamp. Start by attaching the mantle to the burner, just line up the tabs and turn it to lock it into place. And as you do this, keep your fingers away from the meshy part of the mantle. Use the metal wires on the side to hold on to it. After that, get ready for a pretty epic flare-up. Make sure nothing flammable is anywhere near you, and keep your face and anything else that you want to keep attached to you and not charred far away from the mantle. Use a match or lighter to burn the blue coating off, and once you get it started, it's not going to take too long. Just don't burn down your house in the process or breathe all the fumes afterwards. After you get that done though, you can place the chimney onto the top of the burner and everything should be ready to use. So between the 3 lighting methods we've talked about today, LED lighting is by far the most convenient. Candle lanterns work well for long-term situations where society is completely falling apart, and then also, run-of-the-mill winter power outages. And then Aladdin lamps are somewhere between the two. They're brighter than candles, but not as bright as LEDs. However, they do produce a significant amount of heat, which is useful during colder months, and LEDs don't do that. But of course, lighting isn't the only thing that you would need during a long-term blackout, especially if it happens in winter. So if you want to see the 7 most important things to take care of before this winter, then click here. Or if you want to see my full prepper energy plan, then click here. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.